Let's talk about tarps. So a tarp is a fantastic piece of equipment that allows us to get a group out of the rain or other elements. It can be used for a shelter for sleeping under. It can be used as a shelter for cooking under. And they can be very quickly and easily set up if you know what you're doing. So this video is about how to set up a tarp effectively. Lots of different ways to set up a tarp. There are wrong ways to set up a tarp, but there's really no one right way to do so. A little acronym I'd like you to think about is having a quiet tarp. So Q-U-I-E-T, quiet. So the Q is for quick release. All of your knots that you tie for your tarp should be able to be released very quickly and not have to pick at those knots, especially after it rains and that rope swells. The U is for uniform tension, so you want your tarp to be nice and tense throughout. The I is for incline. You want a reasonable pitch to your roof, so if it rains or snows, that will run off nicely and not create a big reservoir. The E is for elevation. How high do you want your tarp? So if you're cooking under it, you want it quite high, so there's room to move around and walk. If you're sleeping under it, lower is probably better. It doesn't catch as much wind. And then finally, the T is for tight. You want your tarp to be tight, and so you're going to be using tensioning knots to make sure you get it as snug as you can. Okay, let's go through how to set up a tarp. So first of all, I have my tarp in a bag here. This is a sill tarp, which is a very lightweight, high-tech tarp, about 2.5 by almost 3 meters in size. And on each corner and on some of the other tag points on the tarp, you'll find guy lines. And the guy lines are what makes the tarp work. So make sure you have at least 2 to 3 meters of rope on each of the corners of your tarp, and then some of the intermediate points. I also, to help with my tarp setup, carry a few tent pegs. So in this case, there's about 4 to 6 tent pegs. So if I don't have trees, I can still set the tarp up. So I'm going to set this tarp up using a tree and using a piece of equipment many people carry when they're backpacking, which is known as a trekking pole. Okay, like we talked about, we want uniform tension on the tarp. And to achieve that, we may need to do some adjustments once we have the tarp set up. So for example, here we want all of this to be in a line. And you'll notice that this pole is slightly off to the left. So if we just pick the pole up and we move it and get it into line, now the physics of the tarp are going to work out much better in your favor. We can do that on the corners as well. So over here, this guy line comes out completely bisecting the angle of the tarp. If this is a 90-degree angle and you bisect that, it should follow directly down through the guy line to the peg, which we are showing here. Okay, what we've done now is set up a tarp that is really ideal for sleeping under. It's quite low to the ground. You could probably fit 2 to 3 people under this tarp for an incredibly lightweight shelter. It does have a couple drawbacks, of course. One of them is if the weather's really cooking, so you get some high winds, driving rain. Obviously, it's not the best setup. You may want to lower down the tarp a little bit more, which you could do if you had a trekking pole that is adjustable. And the other drawback is, of course, it's not bug-proof. So if you don't like the creepy crawlies, then this may not be for you. If a member of your party becomes injured when you're out doing an outdoor activity and the weather is not great, it's raining or it's really windy, then this type of tarp setup is also fantastic for getting that injured party and the first aiders out of the elements. And it doesn't matter if it's not too low to the ground, because you're going to be underneath and they may be lying down in prone position. And so this is a fantastic thing to be able to put up quickly in an outdoor leadership role. So I'm standing under a tarp that's been set up as a cook tarp or perhaps a lunch tarp for a group on a rainy day. Nice elevation to it, and to get that elevation we're using the trees around you. So in this case we have some nice big trees, so we're able to utilize that. We're also using the quick release knots again. We've got an incline. In this case we're using a lean-to type of tarp with a high on one side and a low on the other, so any rain that comes down will just slide off to the low side. We also have uniform tension, again using the same angles, and we have a tight tarp. So even though the high tarp is going to catch more wind, so typically if you are using a high tarp like this, you have to be very careful if it's windy, and I would definitely recommend taking it down after you finish cooking and not leaving it up overnight if it's windy, because you may wake up to a ripped tarp. So a small addition to this tarp is a center pole, which is a very high-tech piece of wood that I found around. You could also use a kayak paddle, anything that gives you some elevation, maybe a couple of trekking poles that are lashed together. And it just goes up into a little tab here and creates a bit more elevation to your tarp and also more incline, and will stop that potential for pooling of water on your tarp as the rain comes down and the fabric sags. When it comes to attaching the corners of your tarp, you can get pretty creative. You don't necessarily need to use tent pegs. You can use trees as we've shown. You can also use little sticks like we show here, stuck into softer ground. If you have root systems, you can bury underneath the roots and attach your tarp guy line to the root itself. So you're really only constrained by creativity when it comes to how you attach your tarp to the ground.